everywhere in Europe. Is that a problem? I would say yes and no. In some places, notably tourism hotspots, that is a problem. And it's linked not only to housing, but also to other side effects of over-tourism. But it also comes with benefits in less crowded parts of Europe. It can be a source also of investments in renovation, etc. So the picture is a little bit diverse. What are we now doing in order to improve the regulatory landscape around short-term rentals and notably empower local authorities to devise the proper policy solutions? First of all, together with the Parliament, we've been coming up with the short-term rental regulation, and the Chair has already mentioned it. This is about creating transparency. Transparency about what properties are rented out, by whom, for how long. Transparency based on registration obligations combined with an obligation to collect and also distribute data. And these obligations exist on platforms. Short-term rental regulation, great transparency tool, but not yet into practice. The deadline for implementation, putting up that data collection and transmission system, is actually May of 26. So we're working very hard with cities and with platforms. Some member states will go quicker. Spain will go quicker. That means that they will be able to get all the data they need earlier. Second area of work, tax. Yeah, DAC 7, but also the VAT in the digital age. Steps have been taken to make sure that platforms collect VAT. That is not yet a reality, but will become a reality when when the VIDA in the digital age is being adopted and enters into force. What already exists now is an obligation to provide on platforms to provide information on income tax, on revenue collected by the hosts. So this will create a better level playing field, and again, it increases transparency in the short-term rental markets. Third area of work, market access rules. Yeah? Local authorities regulate short-term rentals, and that's their right to do so. The rules are clear on this. You can regulate short-term rentals, provided you do it in a justified and proportionate manner, because you are regulating an economic activity. And that's where the Services Directive comes into play. There is court jurisprudence. There is quite a number of ongoing pilot cases, meaning discussions between Commission and cities on how to get it right, making sure that rules are proportionate, targeted, don't go further than what is necessary. So a whole casuistic is being built up in this area. And by the way, also national courts play their role. And then last but not least, in my former head of tourism, we lost that competence now, but tourism is going to be very important also in this mandate. We're looking at how to better diversify tourism flows. If in tourism hotspots, housing is a problem because of too many short-term rentals, diversification of tourism flows can, of course, also help reducing pressures, including housing pressures. That's where we are today. So lots of rules already exist, but it is a question of implementing them, sharing best practices, and we're very open to more dialogue. And with this, I hand over to my colleague, Katarina.
Yeah, and you have 40 seconds left.
Oh, sorry.
Don't worry, I'm not speaking about already existing policies, but about the fact that we are in the construction unit for which I'm responsible. We are responsible for the strategy for housing construction, and we are at the beginning of our reflections. So I cannot present a lot of things that already are. I can first make a call to everybody to contribute to our initiative by providing us with data, by providing us with stories, by providing us with problems and solutions, but with ideas. Because all those we will integrate into our reflections at the moment. I may, for another 5 seconds, say we touch several areas. We will touch several areas, but our main point is to increase the supply of housing, and not by getting it away from the short-term rental market, that's my colleague, but by having actually just more of it, by building more, by boosting the construction industry. And there are various areas we are working on, but in the interest of time, I keep that a secret until we see each other again.
Thank you so much, and thanks also for the call to contribute. I think this is also one reason why we are organizing this hearing, to gather a little bit our ideas that we can contribute in the Commission strategy. So last but not least, in the first round of speakers, I welcome Claire Collum, Professor of Land Economy, the University of Cambridge, and you are connected online. Welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you very much for welcoming me at this hearing. Next slide, please. I'm going to present the results of a collaborative European project developed by French and Italian colleagues who are named on the slide, Thomas Aguilera, Francesca Ottioli, and Tatiana Morera. And we have effectively spent the past few years studying the regulation of short-term rental at the municipal level in 12 cities that you can see listed on this slide. Next slide. What I will present are the main tools that have been used by cities to regulate short-term rental. So in our study, we have seen that regulations at the local level have emerged via different policy domains: tourism, land use planning, housing, business licensing, among others. They have obviously been shaped by regional and national legislation that in different countries give different room for maneuver for cities to actually regulate, more or less room for maneuver. What we have also found is that most cities actually distinguish between different types of short-term rentals, and they in particular try to separate the professional permanent short-term rental of a holiday home from the occasional rental of a primary residence or a room in a primary residence. Next slide. In our study, we have tried to create a typology of the very precise policy instruments that different cities have used to regulate short-term rentals, and we have broadly categorized them into two different groups. Instruments that actually shape access to the market, that is, the extent to which an operator can put a housing unit on the market, and a set of tools that shape the operation of the market, notably in terms of taxation obligation or the reporting of guests. In the first category, we have seen a number of tools that are used differently in different cities: authorization or license requirement to conduct an activity or to change a planning use, maximum number of days that are allowed for the short-term rental of a primary home. In some cities, quantitative restrictions on the total number of short-term rentals in particular areas, or other rules for differentiation between places. And also a number of rules that seek to prohibit short-term rental, for example, in social housing or of second homes in a number of cities. Next slide. We have tried to create an index of intensity of regulation, and this is a quite, simplified version of reality, where we have looked at, in these 12 cities, which of the instruments I have mentioned are present for the three types of short-term rentals that I have mentioned. And that allows us to, if you want, create a relatively easy classification of cities depending on the intensity with which they regulate short-term rentals. And this is a snapshot of our typology in 2022. And this was before the announcement made by the mayor of Barcelona that licenses would be revoked, and this would change slightly if we were to redo this now. And you can see that there are different attitudes to regulation in terms of intensity between cities that have made the political choice to regulate in a stronger way, like Lisbon, Barcelona, or Amsterdam in our sample, cities that have taken a relatively liberal free market approach to that process, Rome, London, and Prague, and many cities which are somewhere in the middle, in particular seeking to regulate permanent short-term rental, but perhaps taking a more tolerant approach to the occasional rental of a primary home. Next slide. Next slide, please. All the cities are facing similar implementation and enforcement challenges, and all of you who have worked on this topic will be familiar with these. I am not going to go into details. I just wanted to mention, the four main categories. The lack of data, which is now hopefully going to be resolved thanks to the implementation of the new data sharing regulation. Difficulties with physical control in real urban space, trying to actually track down and control illegal units. A complex relationship between city government government and platforms, which have oscillated between collaboration and conflict in trying to get the platform to comply with city requests. And finally, as you will be aware, there's also quite a lot of contentious politics and court cases all the way to the EU level that have challenged some of the strict regulation. Next slide. There are two pieces of EU law that have already been mentioned that have been absolutely fundamental in framing the possibility of regulation. One applies to platform, the e-commerce directive and its follow-up through the Digital Markets Act, and the services directive that was already mentioned, and that applies to the operators of short-term rental themselves. And that directive has been complemented by case law from the Court of Justice of the European Union that allows certain forms of regulation to meet the public interest objective of combating housing shortage. Next slide. The latest piece of EU legislation we heard about, which is going to significantly improve the situation for transparency, as was mentioned, is the regulation on data sharing. And I won't enter into the details, but I simply want to point out that in the preparation of this piece of legislation and in the wide-ranging set of views that were expressed during the public consultation that DG GROW ran, there was a tension between two broad sets of position. On the one hand, the single market perspective.
Just a warning, your time is running up.
Yeah, that emphasized the diversity of local regulation as burdensome, and on the other hand, the concerns of city government that emphasize the subsidiarity principle and their capacity to regulate. Next slide and conclusion. So I just wanted to summarize what we found by outlining that short-term rental are a hybrid object of regulation. They're a service and therefore subject to single market rules, but they're also a land use which is subject to public interest regulation. And the European Parliament has a key role to play in mediating between these two dimensions in order to support the principle of access to decent and affordable housing in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. I think it was extremely interesting. I have now 14 colleagues on my list. Thank you so much for the big interest. Just if you are also ready to speak in the second round, you can let me know because there will be a second round. But if I take all the 14, then we will not so much have time in the second round, just a warning. And we start, I have all of you. So you can also take down your panels. But we start with our chair of the Special Committee on the Housing Crisis, Irene Tinali. I'm very happy that also the House Committee is present today.
Thank you very much, Chair. Now, this is a question both for the Commission and the mayors in part, but we are increasingly witnessing a sort of an overlap between two markets that are the touristic markets with the short rentals and the traditional residential market in some cities and regions. So it's like these two markets are encroaching. So given that short-term rentals and long-term residential housing, they are two different markets, but they rely on the same stock of houses. It's like they're using the same infrastructure, the same capacity that are serving two completely different markets. My question is, do you see the need for a clearer differentiation between these two markets in terms of regulatory approaches? And are there additional measures at the European level that could be helpful to better support this differentiation so we can ensure both things, housing availability for residents on one hand and in the sustainable short-term rental sector? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Irene gave a great example with the timing. So try to stick in 1 minute. I know it's difficult, but then it's solidaric because then we have more members who can take the floor. So we start with the EPP with Pablo Arias Echeverria.
I'm going to speak in Spanish.
I'm going to speak in Spanish like the two mayors who join us from Spain. First of all, a comment, and it concerns these short-term rentals. It is a serious problem that we have on our hands here. It's not just a question of the rent being paid for such short-term rentals. I wanted to actually raise the question of legal certainty. You know, we have a problem on our hands here. The situation might continue, and I wanted to put a question to the Mayor of Madrid. He referred to this in his comments, but I wanted to ask what the City Hall of Madrid is doing about the problem with which it is faced, and secondly, what kind of measures, for instance, tax incentives, could be adopted in order to stimulate better supply.
For the SND, Laura Ballarin.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the mayors, thank you also to the experts for their comments, and thank you for this very interesting hearing. It's really important for us to address this question of housing. We have a crisis throughout the whole of Europe. Tourism rentals is something that we deal with in this committee, and it can be advantageous for tourism purposes, for instance, but of course it also poses certain problems in terms of displacement of market supply and access to ordinary housing. Here in the European Parliament, we have looked at a law with greater transparency, greater requirements for the platforms that work with municipalities, but we need to go beyond that, I think. A couple of questions from my side. First of all, to the Mayor Colboni. The city of Barcelona has taken the lead in Europe when it comes to access to housing. You've taken the lead. But what more can we do in Europe as a whole in order to support these town halls that are under pressure, where there is a tension on the market? What more can we do in order to help them out? Secondly, and I address this question to Mayor Almeida, you spoke about rents for these short-term rentals, and of course that is very much the subject of this hearing. I was wondering, in Madrid, do you have any particular view on tourism rentals and the way in which it impacts upon the market? And what about Airbnb? What about their interests in this? Also, when it comes to paying these rents, we have an issue there. I was wondering why you were in fact opposed to the increase on the minimum wage in Spain as a whole. Thank you.
Klára Dostálová.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll speak Czech. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their contributions. On the 9th of February, we saw in Madrid protesters who carried signs, "Housing is a right." And I must say I agree with them. Inter alia, as a former minister in the Czech Republic who was responsible for housing and housing regulations, and I know it's very difficult to find out the identity of individuals who offer their houses, flats to tourists as individuals without adhering to any regulations, fire hazards, etc. So my question is really to the European Commission. Could you perhaps think about whether flats, apartments that are approved as permanent housing really are used as permanent housing, that they're not taking the place of hotels and other shorter-term housing solutions? And my second question for all the panelists, the supervision bodies, whereby we know that the implementation of the short-term rentals regulation will be as of May 2026, will the data in these registration systems be available to other entities in order to be able to check that the providers do adhere to regulations, fire hazard, etc., etc.? Thank you.
Much. I didn't know you were the Minister of Housing. That's very interesting. So now for the SND, Pier Francesco Maran.
Thank you, Chair. First, this is not just a Spanish problem, but it's a global problem of every cities that are facing the fact that demographic issues are changing. We have students, we have young workers, we have rich people moving to cities, and of course we have tourists. And there is also a change on finance, where investment helps the fact that prices are going up and up. I think that if we don't face every problem and not just a single one, we don't obtain results. Of course, we have to build more and more affordable housing, not just more. But even in this case, there is a desire of cities that is bigger than what we can build. Short-term rental, it's one of the problems. It's not just a matter of housing, that is the main issues, but it's also a matter of change of the culture of a city, because it changes shops, etc. I think, and it's interesting, and I ask both the mayor if this coalition of mayor Colboni was talking about can be a way to experiment a new relationship direct from EU and cities. Commission said we are studying, and it's important we study, but we have to move to a try and fix system because while we study, we have 68% of growth of prices in 10 years. And if we need 2-3 years to obtain some new rules, it's too slow.
Thank you. And now Stefano Cavedagna for ECR.
Yeah. Mr. President, thank you. I will speak in Italian. Ringrazio intanto I nostri ospiti.
I too would like to extend my thanks to our guests and those also who have taken the floor to ask some questions, because it's all been very informative. We need to look carefully at the question of leases, housing, and the whole housing market. So there are a lot of issues that we need to address, and they're interconnected, many of them. I would like to talk from the perspective of my country, Italy, and focus particularly on the large number of stakeholders that are involved in this sector. There's FIAIP, which is an Italian federation of estate agents, and this is a body which has identified a lack of housing provision. And they've also identified that it is not due to the tourist sector. If a family owns a flat or a house and is free to decide what to do with it, whether they're going to live in it or whether they're going to let it short-term or long-term, then this has implications for society. So this is something which we need to look at carefully. The Conservatives, of course, are keen to protect private property as a concept, but we feel that it's important to come up with a system of incentives. This could help to create a shift from short-term to longer-term rents, which would be helpful to the market. So in conclusion, Chairman, I think there's a lot of work to be done, but we must bear in mind the need to protect private property. Thank you.
Me? Okay. Well, sorry, I wasn't expecting. First of all, I was one of those MEPs who worked with the short-term rentals regulation during the previous mandate. And just was explained by the Commission, well, the main aim is to have transparency and data about what's happening. In that sense, I completely agree with the housing of permanent housing problems in some bigger cities. But at the same time, of course, we shouldn't over-regulate that sector and also blame the short-term rentals for the housing crisis, which is probably not the primary reason of this big crisis we are facing all over Europe. And because short-term rentals, in terms of those platforms, have really improved the ways how Europeans travel right now. And in that sense, I think that we should really see the balance, and this is my question to the participants, where do you see the balance of, well, having transparency and having the rights of municipalities to regulate that sector, but at the same time not trying to impose one size fits all and to over-regulate the whole sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now for SND, José Cepeda.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to do, obviously, is thank our guests, particularly the mayors from Madrid and Barcelona, for being here today. And I'd like to thank all the experts for their contributions. I have some questions I'd like to ask, particularly regarding Madrid and what the intention is regarding short-term rents. The market in Spain is very regional or sectoral, and there are 17,000 flats or properties which are being rented out but not under the rules and regulations that apply. The other problem in Spain can be that these short-term rentals are actually in the centre of cities, and therefore young people have no access at all to housing. It isn't a question of buying a house. They have no access to a roof over their heads in the centre of a big city, and so they have to go and live on the absolute periphery of the city or elsewhere. So there's a big implication for this, and it would be interesting to see how the models are actually applied in practice and what the outcome is. We've heard that the initiatives in Barcelona have actually delivered an improvement and that there is some better access for young people now to decent housing. So this is really important. It's very interesting to look at these models. It's all very well to talk about exerting pressure on the market, but the real pressure that we see all too often is pressure on the young people, and that's what we really have to address as a priority. Thank you.
Did you say my name?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. I was still listening to the translation.
No. I think a lot of members have the same problem. Probably I should say it more clearly. Kim van Sparentag.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you so much also to the panel, and it's very good to have this discussion again, also specifically focusing on short-term rentals. I was the rapporteur in the previous mandate, and it's very interesting to hear also from the local perspective, and it was always wonderful to also work with a lot of people from the local perspective in the last mandate on this. I have a question to the Mayor of Madrid. Because I've been looking into your short-term rental regulation, and you say there that you are going to, in principle, ban short-term rentals in the historic center from residential buildings, but in the new short-term rentals, it will still be allowed in entire buildings dedicated solely to tourist accommodation. And I would like to ask if there's not a worry that it will actually encourage investors to kick out tenants in order to flip entire buildings into tourist accommodations. And I have a question also to the Mayor of Barcelona, because we know that you have put in place very strict rules, and I would argue that when students or essential workers can't afford to live in a city, there's a crisis situation, and therefore drastic measures are proportionate. But we know that the Commission has expressed different views, and I was wondering if you have already received questions from the European Commission or pushback on your announced plans. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For the left, Leila Chabi. Or you didn't want to speak? No, yes.
Oui, merci Madame la Présidente.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you from me also to everybody who's participated. I'm very interested to hear that there's a growing awareness on the lack of supply in the housing market. It is really a problem of lack of supply. We've got excessive demand. So listening to what has been said by some of the experts, which is that it'd be better to increase the supply, but this would also mean that some people wouldn't be able to afford to pay for higher rents, and they'd have nowhere to stay. The other point is that Airbnbs, of course, remove long-term rent possibilities from the market. Therefore, we need to find a balance, and I'd like to see what von der Leyen intends to do. She's put housing as a priority in her roadmap, but we really do need to address short-term rents as a matter of priority. In the context of this regulation, Kim was the rapporteur, the Commission did have a lot of input. So following what we've heard from the Mayor of Barcelona, what would the Commission's response be to amending a regulation or having a new regulation on short-term rents? I'd be very interested to hear what the Commission would intend, because that would make much more property available right across the market at all price levels, especially more affordable prices, and it would rebalance the market. Thank you. The next speaker is Brando Benifei for the S&D.
Dear colleagues, thank you for organizing this very important moment of exchange on housing rental issues. Like colleague Ijavs, I've been working for my political group on the regulation on the collection and sharing of data on short-term accommodation rental services. I'm happy as shadow rapporteur of what we achieved, but that was only one step to give to the authorities the tools to implement effective policies on short rentals in our cities. And it's clear also from what we heard the importance of this issue, of this area, for the impact on housing at large. In fact, in my country, university students took to the streets, sleeping in tents to demonstrate against the high costs of rents, which make life impossible for students, but not only for them. But they, I think, highlighted the problem in a clear way to the general public. And in fact, the legislative vacuum on short-term rentals is a real problem that has to be treated also at European level, where the current legislation in place is not sufficient. So my question is for any speaker that wants to pick it up. I see today that we discussed in most of the interventions, not all, but most, on the impact on construction, industry and new houses. But I'd like to understand what we should do with the existing ones in terms of regulating the sector both at national and European level and avoiding the cities to stay in a situation of uncertainty from a regulatory point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. For EPP, Marion Walzmann.
Ja, ich werde Deutsch sprechen.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for what is already turning out to be an excellent hearing. I'd particularly like to thank the mayors for coming here today. Cities in the European Union and elsewhere, of course, like New York, but of course Paris, Lisbon and Barcelona are all in the EU. Lots of cities within and out with the EU have got a lot of restrictions on short-term rents. Airbnb is a case in point. Others have already mentioned it. But there are additional issues too. What sort of evidence do we actually have about the impact on the market of banning short-term rents? Does this actually lead to more properties becoming available at realistic prices on the market? Can people afford to rent them? Does it lead to a reduction in rents? Do you have any data or information on that? Thank you.
And now we have for the S&D, Idoia Mendia.
Sí, muchas gracias. Bueno, yo quería tomar...
Thank you. Well, I wanted to take the floor, of course, first of all, to thank all the experts for being here, particularly the Spanish mayors, because these are cities which are very instructive in terms of reality on the ground and policy and how to make life more livable for the citizens. So these are very important insights that we've had from them. I'd like to focus particularly on Barcelona. Barcelona has been very much in the vanguard here. They've been very courageous in what they've done by way of changing the rules and regulations on housing to try to address the problems. The problems are not peculiar to Barcelona, but they've been very much more courageous than others in trying to address them. Regional governments are very important too, because they need support for the housing policy, which they're often responsible for implementing throughout their areas, whether we're talking about the biggest urban agglomerations or smaller urban centres. So I think you have a lot more information that you could share with us. We'd be very interested to hear it. If there are any more good examples of best practice, this would interest me very much. I come from the Basque Country, and in 2015 there was some legislation allowing investment in the public sector housing on an innovative basis, and this was supposed particularly to provide socially affordable rents for medium and lower incomes for young people and for older people. So I don't know if anyone has any other experience to share on that. Thank you.
Finalize the list.
Danke, dass wir heute...
Thank you. This is a very useful opportunity to discuss examples of best practice. Over and above the examples we've heard about hitherto, I would like to take the debate out a bit more widely and ask you what other sorts of innovative measures might be rolled out Europe-wide. There's a big problem with speculation with land. The greater the shortage, the more the speculation. And we've had difficulties in certain areas in Austria, despite the fact that we've actually introduced a levy on empty properties. Sometimes it's been difficult actually to get this money in. I wonder whether you've tried something similar in Barcelona or in Madrid. I wonder if you even do have empty properties, and if so, do you try to impose any kind of sanction on that? We have a long history of social housing construction in Austria. The rates are not as high as they were, but having said that, we actually envy other countries which have had the courage to impose ceilings and caps on rents so that they don't rise at the rate of inflation. So I'd congratulate everybody who has had the courage to do that. and ask you in conclusion what you think that we could do more widely in Europe, following your examples of best practice, obviously within the bounds of our constitution. Thank you.
I give the last floor to Mr. Buxade Villalba.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you. I have a question for the mayors. Why didn't they do anything for 50 years? Well, they've been governing these cities. Madrid and Barcelona are examples of failure. 65% of the property and 62% in Barcelona is out of the affordability parameters for ordinary families. Why didn't they do something sooner? What's happened that since 2020, the number of shared flats has gone up by 10 times, tenfold. There is a crying need for regulation of the illegal sector, and there's been an exponential increase in demand for housing in these cities. But here in the Economic Committee, we actually voted to reduce VAT on productive housing construction. So I don't know why this is going on in the way it is. In Barcelona, the situation is ludicrous, and the issue of buying a house is completely out of question. People can't even afford to rent one, let alone buy one. And a large number of people have taken their properties off the market, of course, because of the restrictions that have been imposed. So how is it possible to provide for this and then impose restrictions on traffic in the centre of the town so that people can't even get around the city? This is also undermining the productive economic function of a city. Thank you.
The panelists still have to answer, and we still have a second panel. So I just hope that we can have short and concise answers. But then also all the MEPs are still staying for the second panel, where we also have very exciting experts. So we start in the same order with the mayor of Madrid. So Mr. Martinez, please.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody who has raised all these questions, which are all very important for the futures of our cities. We don't want to have some kind of opposition created between Madrid and Barcelona. That's furthest from our objective. We actually want to be working together and trying to find solutions. I'm not trying to score points of Barcelona or vice versa. I don't think that that's helpful to the solution of a problem which we've absolutely got to find for the citizens of both the cities. We do have to address short-term rents in Madrid, Alsace, where we've got at least 15,000 of them. We've also got properties on the rent which shouldn't be on. They're not there lawfully, and we have got to address this as well. The problem is greatest in the centre of Madrid, but we do need to do something urgently to make life better for the citizens. Madrid ought to be a wonderful city to live in, but the reality is that we're not able to deliver the living conditions that we could. We're talking, of course, about the traffic issues as well. We're talking about the very centre of Madrid, within the ring roads, where the pressure on housing is the greatest. So we do need to have some kind of action taken on that, because that is the area where most of the tourists will also end up wanting to live. So we've got to find solutions here for what could be done, for example, at the right level in the economy. We've got to do something to provide for quality residential housing, but at the same time, tertiary sector activity has got to be made possible. This is really very important, so we should focus on trying to have better economic profitability, not drying out all the productive economy from the centre of Madrid, but creating a situation where it's possible for people to live in a reasonable residential area. A lot of potential holiday lets have been taken off the market already, and I think this is making us review our policy. some tourists obviously don't want to come to the centre of Madrid, although there has been a lot of pressure historically on rents in that area. So we need to try to see this whole issue in the round, and we need also to remember the legal issues, which are not irrelevant. Many people have raised the question of the ownership rights to property and the fact that we can't be breaching the private property rights of people who own properties. But at the moment, there is a situation where there is a great disequilibrium in the market and where we are not able to balance the demand and we're not able to provide the services that we need. We're not able to impose the tax provisions which we actually need, which would help to regulate this market. The government has been reluctant to use the tax levers which it could have used, and we therefore could talk about the minimum wage, we could talk about, as I said, taxes and contributions that are made to the economy and to the exchequer, but the reality is that wages in Spain are such that many people are not able to afford the properties that are available. So we need to have better jobs, better skills, better accessibility of affordable housing. That's what we need to work on. And it's not just in Madrid.
Y mucho más rápido no puedo hablar, la verdad.
Oh, well, I couldn't probably speak any faster. I'll conclude. Just to saying two more things, which is that we think that you should be very careful with imposing restrictions. I'm not excluding anything ex ante on housing and housing policy, but you have to be careful to see things in the round, as I said. And I also think that we're being told that our model has failed. Well, your party has not been a shining example of excellent urban planning or management either. Thank you.
Colboni. And please a tiny little bit shorter.
Bien, muchas gracias. Una respuesta.
Thank you. Well, I'll just try to summarise some of the questions and answer them as briefly as possible. There isn't a single solution, frankly, to this issue of housing. We have obviously to increase the supply of affordable houses. That is certainly clear. And this is useful, therefore, to hear from the Commission that they are working on investment in public sector housing and affordable housing. And it's useful that there's a Commissioner responsible for this. What we mayors feel is that there are a lot of different points that need to be factored into any European policy. And we need to remember that. We need to make sure that the funds are channeled to the biggest cities, which are really the place where the most grave housing crises exist. Then the second thing is the question of tourism. In the area where there is a real difficulty because of lack of access to housing and a demand from tourists, there does need to be a different balance found, and there has to be clear priority for people living there. We don't need 10,000 tourist flats in Barcelona because there are plenty of hotels. There are small pensiones where people can go and live. The owners of these places are paying taxes and they're creating jobs, and their business model is precisely to provide for tourists. So we don't need all these private residences turning into so-called hotels and excluding the regular citizens from the city. The Spanish legislation, both centrally and locally, is clear. And we are clear that if we have areas that we've identified where we feel we should apply these restrictions, we will do this, because we feel that we've got plenty properties in Spain which at the moment are not exclusively available to potential residents, but are in fact available as tourist flats, and this is the wrong way round. Therefore, we've got to take action regarding not only Airbnb but the other platforms too. We have been working on this for years. We've got 3,600 more flats on the market now. They were previously being rented legally, and they're now available as affordable rents. And therefore, the important thing in every single city is to try to identify what your particular issues are and what particular solutions are best suited to your location. I feel that regulations in the plural, are extremely important. I do believe in capping rents. I think it's perfectly possible to have regulation to that effect. In December, for example, that's just last year, we actually managed to drive the rents down by 3.6% by introducing these caps. We'll see what happens. It's comparatively new, as you'll understand. But we've stopped the inflation of prices at the moment. I don't know by 2028 what will happen. It certainly will not be the case that there's no tourist accommodation in Barcelona by 2028, but I'd like to think there is much, much less, and that it's residential property, because we've created the possibilities for high quality tourism with people staying in the right sort of accommodation where the citizens can afford to live in the centre of the big cities once again. So there's some very good best practice around. I think it's important to exchange that, but it's also important to have a solution tailor-made to your own location.
Yes, thank you very much. Just regarding whether a model is successful or not, I think that we see very different models have developed in Europe over the decades. And if we just take the example of Spain, indeed, they have built over 6 to 7 million actually social homes since the 60s. However, their policy has been to make the majority of those homes for access to individual ownership. So that is quite different, where we see in other cities where 30% of the housing is indeed either cooperative housing, protected limited profit housing, or social housing. So a different model have developed. And then this has left, obviously, then we have seen the speculative investment coming into the sector, and of course the short-term letting on top of that in very attractive cities. And there we have seen that the absence of that buffer has made it much more difficult to regulate. Therefore, so we have to see, indeed, when we're looking at this from European level, very different models, very different starting points, and very different needs, regulatory needs that need to be introduced. And no, indeed, subsidiarity needs to be a key word. There's not going to be a one solution coming from EU level. And what we also see is that our sector can only act as a buffer to speculation, so the public and limited profit sector, if we have the transparency. So when it comes to short-term letting, so it is clear that it is illegal to actually sublet social housing or different types of general interest housing on short-term letting platforms. However, we need, indeed, the legislation is already helping, but we need to have a review of whether or not we have introduced the correct procedure so that we do have a box where it is clear that people can tick, yes, it is legal to rent out my flat. So we need, this is one of the successes we've had in the legislation introduced, but we need to check, is that actually working? Because if this illegal activity is actually compromising the capacity for these long-term affordable lets being compromised or invaded, let's say, by short-term letting, because obviously the two are in indirect competition. So this is something that would be good to review. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So there were also some questions to the Commission, so I give the floor back to the Commission.
Very briefly, indeed, there were some questions relating to can we not regulate more rules, etc. My answer would be, first of all, dialogue. Yeah, we need to have a dialogue about what is legally feasible, what is also economically and socially desirable, what works, what doesn't work. That, for me, would be absolutely the first step, and we are delighted to be in this hearing today. Subsidiarity has also been raised, and indeed that's also our feeling and our experience that in this area we're dealing with very local issues where the local situation is very different from one to another. So we will have to see how far we can go with rules at a European level, certainly not create one-size-fits-all jackets. And then last but not least, implement Yeah? We're talking about data, we're talking about transparency, we're talking about tax rules, but these rules are still needing to be implemented, and that's going to be taking a lot of our bandwidth, and we count also on your political support to make that happen in practice. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And then I give the floor back to our expert, Professor Colomb.
I shall be brief. I just wanted to respond to one of the first points on should we treat separately short-term rental regulation and the regulation of long-term rental, if I understood correctly. In our study, we very clearly showed that when regulation was becoming stricter in one of those sectors, investment and investors tended to move their property in the other sector, with a third medium-term rental, which was raised by our Spanish mayors as becoming also a new grey area of investment and lack of regulation. So in a nutshell, if the political objective of a city council is to protect affordable housing and the housing stock, in an ideal world, regulation has to be thought through in all these sectors in order to have a net aggregate effect and avoid an escape from one sector to the other.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. Thanks to the first experts and panels. I think that was really, really interesting, informative. I think we could discuss forever, but unfortunately we're limited in time. Directly jumping to the second panel, I'm very much looking forward now to the different stakeholders' perspectives. And we start with Victoria Mollner, Secretary General of the European Holiday Home Association. You have also 7 minutes.
Thank you. Dear Ms. Sana Cavazzini, dear IMCO committee members, dear participants, so you were talking a lot about the short-term rentals, so being a representative of these short-term rentals, I feel absolutely no pressure, right? All right, so thank you for allowing us to present European Holiday Home Association viewpoint on the important matter of affordable housing. Affordable housing is a significant issue affecting millions in Europe, and the European Union is increasingly involved on this matter, with short-term rentals being a part of it. European Holiday Home Association is the collective voice of short-term rentals. EHHA is comprised of national associations which represent property managers, property owners, online short-term rental platforms, and companies offering ancillary services to short-term rental accommodation providers. The short-term rental ecosystem extends beyond the so well-known peers, hosts, and few online platforms, and it includes a diverse area of participants of varying sizes and roles. Ancillary services providers play a vital part in supporting these short-term rental players. And short-term rentals are much more than a temporary lodging options. According to the consumer surveys, such as Eurobarometer poll, an impressive 89% of previous short-term rental customers would recommend these services, highlighting the widespread popularity and the market's demand-driven nature. The short-term rentals provide economic, cultural, and environmental benefits, making them an integral part of EU's tourism ecosystem. In 2023, the economic activities associated with short-term rentals contributed to a total of 149 billion euros to the GDP, accounting for 23% of the tourism sector within the European Union. Short-term rentals also generated 40 billion euros in tax revenue, supported over 2 million jobs, and resulted in 74 billion euros in wages. So the issue of regulating housing and tourism, particularly in the context of short-term rentals, presents a complex legal landscape within the EU. While the member states retain primary authority over housing and tourism policies, the EU also plays a significant role in shaping regulations that impact the single market. In the context of short-term rentals, the EU's involvement is substantial. We have several key regulations, such as GDPR, Digital Services Act, Services Directive, Directive on Administrative Cooperation in the Field of Tax, so-called DAC7. Last week, European Parliament passed the opinion on the VAT in the Digital Age Initiative, VIDA. That also applies to online short-term rental platforms. And the regulation on the short-term rental data collection and sharing is being particularly significant. Let's not overlook the pivotal role of Eurostat in collection of aggregated short-term rental data, facilitated by the landmark agreement between the European Commission and the online short-term rental platforms. The regulation on the short-term rental data collection and sharing and collaboration with Eurostat ensures comprehensive and accurate data that is essential for informed and data-driven policy making within the short-term rental sector at the local level. The short-term rental industry has made and is making significant strides in adhering to the regulations and obligations set forth by the EU. And this commitment showcases the industry's dedication to operating within the legal framework and contributing positively to local economies. In the ongoing debate about the lack of available and affordable housing, raising rents, climate change, over-tourism, short-term rentals often become a focal point. While they can face criticism as contributors to the urban challenges, it is important to recognize that short-term rentals are just one piece of a complex puzzle and rarely a significant piece when the problem is looked as a whole. According to the 2023 study of Oxford Economics, the proportion of overall housing stock dedicated to short-term rentals in Lisbon, Barcelona, Madrid, Paris, Berlin, and Amsterdam does not exceed 1.5%. So what then are the fundamental causes of the housing crisis, and how can data serve as a valuable tool for policymakers to direct discussions and aid the areas in the greatest need? Addressing these urban challenges requires a holistic approach that goes beyond targeting short-term rentals alone. Effective solutions involve engaging all economic players in developing future-focused housing and tourism policies. EU regulation on the short-term rental data collection and sharing is not a cure-all for all housing and over-tourism issues, but it is the most valuable tool to help cities design fair and effective short-term rental rules. The regulation can help ensure that when restrictions are placed on short-term rental providers, these restrictions are imposed in a targeted and informed way. Blanket and unjustified short-term rental bans do little to solve housing challenges and, to the contrary, create significant damage to private people, local communities and Europe's tourism sector. Somebody asked about if short-term rental bans work. We have numerous situations, numerous cities which try to follow this road, and we can say that after a few years, the data shows that bans do not work. Recent example is New York City. New York City banned short-term rentals. All online platforms were forced not to advertise short-term rentals. What happened? All the people went into the black shadow, so-called shadow economy. They started advertising short-term rentals on social media, Facebook and Instagram. These social media platforms falls out of the EU regulatory framework, so it will be even more difficult to regulate. And on the top of that, this New York City ban did absolutely nothing to the housing. The housing prices are still increasing. They are still facing huge affordability crisis. It is clear that EU has already established a robust legislative framework for short-term rentals. However, the challenge lies not in the absence of more short-term rental rules at EU level, but in the application and implementation of existing EU regulatory framework for short-term rentals. So we don't need any more minimum standards to regulate short-term rentals. We don't need to make amendments to the regulation on the short-term rental data collection and sharing because the minimum standards are already there. So we have the Services Directive, we have regulation on the short-term rental data collection and sharing, and many more. Just to finish with the last remark, so what we would ask the IMCO committee, we would ask you to work further and to ensure that effective implementation of the short-term rental regulation is there, and also raise awareness of the importance of all EU regulations impacting the short-term rentals, Services Directive included, and we stand ready to continue working on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we now directly jump to your neighbor, to Mark Bookwaite, European Cities Alliances on Short-Term Rentals. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to the committee and the House for receiving me. And I'm here to speak on behalf of an alliance of European cities that have been working on short-term rentals over the last 4 or 5 years. Very fruitfully together with the European Parliament and in particular this committee. So I thank you for this in regard of the short-term rental regulation that will see its implementation, I hope, in 2026. Maybe this is maybe this is one of the bridges that we can agree on, that we both look forward to its successful implementation, but we might have different views on how that will work. I'd like to also thank both the mayors of the cities of Barcelona and Madrid, who I, of course, fully support in their messages and the urgency of the situation in our cities with regard to affordable housing. Maybe I'd like to start with something from my city, Amsterdam, just as a context information. Last year, we received over 23 million visitors or overnight stays due to tourism in our city. That has basically something like 900,000 inhabitants. Just to give you this figure, you don't need to be very good in figures or economics, I think, to understand and appreciate that if you have a house or a unit, or maybe several houses or units in my city, it will be very, very profitable, if we have no regulations at all, to exploit that unit or those units by short-term stays throughout the year, as opposed to the residential use. So it is for us, it has been for us very important to see that the European Court of Justice ruled in the Cali Apartments case that indeed regulations limiting or balancing, limiting the exploitation of housing through short-term rentals is actually very, very well placed in view of protecting a general public interest, which is access to affordable housing in our cities. So we were very welcoming to that decision. And I'm quoting this in particular because it is important to see that in respect of the Services Directive, for example, we see the European Commission looking at the short-term rental regulations in our cities with a curious, very interested eye. They are actually looking into this, and they are then asking, is it well balanced, this approach? Is it proportionate? So we, as City Alliance, fully support those member states who in 2023 have actually requested the Commission to stop these so-called EU pilots into our local regulations. And they refer doing so to the Cali Apartments judgment case. So I just wanted to make that point. Our housing stock, it is very clear, is primarily used for residential use. We have to accommodate so many people that we need in our cities and that are important to the social fabric of our community. In that respect, we hope the regulation that will see its life in 2026 will give us very precise data so that we can see and check if any activity on rentals, on short-term rentals, is in fact respecting our local regulations. We are concerned with the preparatory work in this at the moment. We know that it is not an easy digital system to set up. One of the things I'd like to highlight here, and member states are already discussing this with each other and with the European Commission, that's the issue that was also referred to by some members here in the House, which is on platforms, short-term platforms, any accommodation is being offered. There is actually such a wide variety, as Claire Colomb rightfully mentioned also. It can be hotels, it can be motels, it can be hostels, it can be even campsites. Actually, even sea containers are being offered. I'm not joking. This was a few years back. A very entrepreneurial guy placed 2 sea containers in my city. Like, you put them on Place Lux, They had 2 little windows, and the toilet. And probably they were offered on the short-term rental sites with something like, you will have a unique experience in Amsterdam. But the guests who finally booked these sea containers, when they saw what they were booking, they actually went straight to an ordinary and good hotel in my city. So anything is out there. And the short-term rental regulation has issues with how to process the data respecting all these different units. And actually what we now see happening probably is that the host, by self-declaration, can just think and say, okay, I'm I'm offering something else than short-term rentals, and then he or she can continue in the system. It will be on offer on the platform, and there will be no data sharing. There will be no transparency whatsoever. So this is an issue that we really want to raise already in this house. So maybe another thing that I'd like to raise: short stay rentals is an aspect of the housing market that we see currently much in increase. These are apartments that are fully furnished and that are being rented out, say, for a few months, maybe up to a year. This part of the housing market is regulated by national or regional local laws. They are offered on platforms, but the platforms don't share any data with the cities on the way, on the activity, how this part of the market is being regulated in a legal way. In Berlin, between 2012 and 2022, this type of the market has doubled in that period, from 9,000 units to roughly 20,000 units. So it's a significant part of the market that I'd like to raise. So yes, again, we thank you and this House and the stakeholders for making the short-term rental regulation possible. We still have quite a few questions on whether the data we will receive will be adequate enough for us to regulate short-term rentals in a balanced way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very interesting insight indeed. We now come to Barbara Steenbergen, Head of EU Liaison Office of the International Union of Tenants, the IUT. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. Thank you for having us. We are here at the Committee for Consumers, and we are the consumers of the housing market. We are the tenants. And I also would say hello to Mrs. Irene Tinagli, Chair of the new Special Committee, not on housing, but on the housing crisis. So we are talking about a crisis going on. And I will try to use my 7 minutes as effective as possible to put you on some, I think, points where you can change law at European level. Next slide, please. First of all, who we are. We are very old. We are more or less the trade union of the tenants. In the next year, we become 100 years old, and our mission is to advocate for fair policy, also for the consumers on the market, which are, most of the time, not on the steering wheel. On the steering wheel is the supply side, the landlords. Next slide, please. I would like to put you on some points which are perhaps haven't said before so drastically, but I think it is my duty to do so. Short-term rentals lead to gentrification, displacement, at the end to evictions and to touristification of entire cities. It is kind of a ladder of escalation. And the rise of short-term rental platforms has led to higher rents, full stop, in entire quarters. We do know that it is a huge, huge issue that short-term rentals drive up the long-term rental prices as well. And this is something, I think, where we have the duty and the obligation to do a regulation on the market and do something at European level, because short-term rental business is not restricted to some cities. This is big European business. This is across borders. These are big investors. So the point is, from our side, we have to prevent that our people, the long-term tenants, are priced out of their own neighborhoods. Next slide, please. I would like to come also to the European Court of Justice, because we need, if we want to have a regulation, we need the European Court of Justice on our side. And there is a clear judgment in the year 2020, which also my colleague from the city of Amsterdam mentioned. There is an overriding reason relating to the public interest to combat the shortage of rental housing. So we have a possibility to regulate, according to the European Court of Justice, here at European level. And the provision of affordable housing overrides the individual profit interests. Full stop. I think this is very clear, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Parliament. You know that also some ugly facts. tenants face a massive problem in paying their rents. Affordable housing is not available anymore, and I think everybody who has a family knows about that. If everybody has the possibility to get an affordable apartment, tell me where this is. I don't know where. This is a European problem, and we have to do something against it. The rents in the last years went up by 22%. 22% in the last 13 years. The inflation went up by 36%. Why is that so important? Because rents are also indexed along inflation points. And last but not least, this has also an influx on the energy prices, because housing is not only the basic rent, but these are also the energy prices. So we do have currently at European level a proportion of more than 10% who are not able to pay their housing costs anymore. They are housing overburdened. And 20%, they face the fact that they have to give more than 1/3 of their disposable housing income for housing. Next slide. We had some city examples. We can be very fast. I just give you the basic facts because this presentation will be distributed afterwards also. So we see Amsterdam, short-term rentals. 1 of 9 units is short-term rental. Barcelona, rent increases by 7%. Property prices raised by 19% because of the existence of short-term rentals. Paris, 95,000 Airbnb listings in the entire city, which are 90% Empire properties. So we are not talking about this nice thing where a poor student or a poor family is renting out one room. No, these are entire properties. This is a business model. Yes? So Prague, 15,000 rental apartments vanished from the regular market and were turned into short-term rental. I think these are facts and figures which are very much disturbing. So what can we actually do about it? How can we protect the people, the tenants, which face this market shift, which is depriving them from their regular homes? What can we do? I think, next slide, one very, very important thing is that we finally recognize that housing is a fundamental right. We are not talking about housing as a commodity as we do it in the last years. Housing is a fundamental right. And when you want to do a fundamental rights-based approach, you have to do something to protect the people to stay in their homes. And the protection for tenants would be that they need to have unlimited rent contracts. This is, Mrs. Tinagli, what you also asked. What are the game changers between the markets? I think the game changer is that the normal case must be an unlimited rental contract. As soon as you start with short-term and limited-time rental contracts, the market is definitely moving, and there are many, many loopholes for landlords then to increase the rents considerably or turn it into short-term rental. I think this is one key message that the committee should have. Last but not least, I think we should go now to the slide on the transparency. So we should move on because time is transparency further on. I think what we can do, next slide, yes. What we can do at European level is we should have transparency about rent prices. So our proposal is to set up a cadastre on rent prices showing a local comparative rent. And last but not least, my last message, Mr. Chair, we need an EU transparency register on real estate transactions. Who owns our city? Who is the beneficial owner in order also to shape market forces back to the regular markets? Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving the perspective of the consumers, of the trade union side, as you said. And now we have, I guess, the other side, Kai Warnecke, President of the International Union on Property Owners.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair, dear members of Parliament, dear ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation this afternoon. Well, I somehow feel to say and now to something completely different, as I'm not prepared to speak on short-term rental housing, but to look at the rental housing market overall. Well, we, as representatives of the private property owners in Europe, we are very happy that the European Union is taking up the chance to look on housing in Europe. It is a critical matter of importance to the society in Europe. And it's a concern not only for tenants, but also for property owners, for the families, and for all individuals who live here. Just to give you a solid ground for your debate at whom you're looking at and whom you're addressing, I'd just like to point out two numbers. 70% of all European citizens live in the homes which they own or their family own. So 70% of Europe's citizens are owner-occupiers. And the rest of the people living in the European Union have, with 2/3 majority, a private landlord as their apartment giver. So if you address the rental market or the owner-occupier market, you will address 90% of private persons. Private persons of this market make up 90%. And that's what I would like you to think about in the first place. You're not addressing Airbnb in majority, you're not addressing big companies, you're not addressing social housing companies, you're addressing your voters. These are represented by UIPI, and if you've got any questions upon this, we're always happy to talk to you. So, what could be looked at by the European Union, by the Parliament, and by the Commission? Well, I think we've heard a lot today about short-term rental and about rental law as measurements of regulations, both on local level and on national level. That is something which has already been shared among the national states a lot. So there is, from our point of view, no reason to look at rental law, especially if you look at the different challenges you face all over Europe. Actually, the problems, and that's why the two mayors were chosen very well, lie within the cities of Europe, the interesting big cities of Europe, whereas the housing problems are completely different in the rural sides and the countrysides of Europe. If you just take what the mayor of Catalonia, of Barcelona just said, he mentioned that the rents in Barcelona rose by 60% and in the rest of Catalonia by 16%, which clearly shows that there is a rental problem within Barcelona, absolutely no doubt. But Catalonia is not like a huge state, it's a part around Barcelona, and already there the development is completely different. So, even though I understand the mayors asking for help from the EU, that's fair enough, housing in the cities is first more a problem of the cities. So, looking at what could be done from the EU level, let me make a few suggestions. We've been missing a special housing view over the last decades in the European Union. And we have seen that a lot of EU legislation has not been in line. And that's why we strongly wish a streamlining of the regulatory process. Let me give you one example from just 2 years ago from this very Parliament. You have chosen to address in the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, that the lowest part of the building stock needs renovation first, the worst part. On the other hand, another part of this Parliament decided to implement taxonomy principles. As a result of taxonomy, sorry, my English, sometimes some words don't work, but taxonomy, those people who are addressed to modernize will not get a credit anymore because banks are badly valued for handing out credits to the worst part of the building stock. Actually, banks can hand out credits to those who build the best building stock under the EU legislation. So now tell me, how is a private property owner supposed to renovate his building if he needs money from the bank, if the banks say, by EU law, you're not able to get any of these monies? And that's a fact we already have in Europe. You're not able to gain money to buy an old piece of property which is on the lowest part of the EPC. And so there are other examples. EPBD again, only focusing on the building, and other directive like the RED focusing on the energy. A building always needs to be thought as a unit. The heating has to be fit into the proper building. If this is not thought as one thing, you will end up in a mess. So streamline this, coordinate EU policies, and then, as a third point, try to make construction affordable again. If you build a house today across Europe, you'll end up with a price per square meter of approximately 3,000 to 3,500 euro without buying the ground, just for building the house. If you want to rent that out, you end up at a square meter price of 20 euro. That is not affordable anymore for most of the citizens of Europe. So by reducing the construction prices, you make it possible again to have more buildings, and that will be one of the major things for you to do. Short-term rental is annoying, but it will for most of the cities not be a solution. No doubt about that, because the number of apartments who are taken away from the market for the whole of Europe is not significant enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, thank you so much for your patience. Domenico Campogrande, Director General of the European Construction and Industry Federation. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. The organization I represent is the European Construction Industry Federation. So we represent the builders, the construction companies from all sizes, from the small ones to the large one. And therefore, I will give here maybe a slightly different perspective to the discussion. But nevertheless, I think that there are issues that I heard several times that are directly connected to our association. And in particular, first of all, the need to increase the supply of housing. We've heard that several times. And at the same time, to ensure that this is affordable. And we have a framework at European level, which is the Green Deal. And we are maybe one of the few sectors who did not complain so much about it, because it provides, of course, huge opportunities for construction. But it's a fact that today, building green houses, more sustainable houses, is more expensive than building traditional ones. And there are various reasons behind that. Green products, green machines are more expensive. We have also a problem of low productivity in construction, which needs to be addressed. But there are also issues at other levels, like administrative burden. When you look at the length of time that you need to get a building permit in some areas, this is also impacting the cost. The availability of land, it's also another issue. There are elements related to financing. They have been mentioned. Reduced VAT rates is also another topic. The access to mortgages by citizens. There are also barriers still within the single market that need to be addressed. And last but not least, it has not been mentioned today, but the lack of workforce. So construction companies are more than willing to provide the supply, but at the moment, in most of the member states, there are no workforce available enough to provide this supply. So the issue is complex, and it needs to be addressed and tackled from these various perspectives if you want to find a solution. You cannot just look at one of them. And for this, I think there is a clear need from the policymaker to have a coordinated approach. And for this, we very welcome the fact that there is this special committee in the European Parliament chaired by Mrs. Tinagli. At the same time, in parallel, a task force inside the European Commission, because sometimes we have seen in the past also a lack of coordination inside the Commission services. So we very welcome this. and of course, the political role of Commissioner Jurgensen for this topic. The EIB also, I would like to mention, because EIB is also working a lot on the financing aspects, and therefore a coordinated approach and intervention by all these actors is needed. We have a position paper on this issue that we can distribute, but again, in this position paper, we highlight the need for a coordinated approach, a tailored approach. It has been mentioned also, the situation in the countries is different, and this needs to be taken into account. The need to mobilize public, but also private money in combination with new financial instruments, this is certainly needed. The access to mortgages for households, certainly homework to be done at national and local level in the administrations. I mentioned the issue of permitting. From our side, we have also homework in terms of fostering research, innovation, more digitalization, also in our industry to increase this productivity that is needed. And finally, again, a strong focus on the labor force, on training, education, reskilling and upskilling of workers. And only by tackling all these elements together, we will be able to address the issue in an efficient manner. From our side, it was said earlier by Mrs. Knapton-Felix, the need to provide input, expertise, and here we are willing to play a role both with the Parliament, with the Commission, and the other stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the excellent inputs. We are running 35 minutes late because there was so much interest in the first panel, so sorry for that. But I would suggest nevertheless that we take like 3 to 4 interventions right now, probably not like 19, but I think that we don't even have 19 members in the room, so that's good. And please try to be concise a little bit. We start again with Irene Tignali, the chair of the Special Committee of the Housing Crisis.
Thank you very much. Now, as I said before, as short-term rentals and long-term residential housing increasingly overlap, there is an increasing tension, which is not only between tenants and owners, but in many cases also among owners themselves. Because it's true that there is the right of the owners to rent their apartment, but there is also other owners that claim their right to live in a residential building and feel safe and don't see dozens of people coming back and forth or don't pay for the damages made by the tourists that are living in the building. So how do you believe that these competing rights can be effectively balanced to ensure a fair and sustainable outcome for both kinds of property owners, whether they are rent or non or tenants? And in some countries, there has been debate over whether homeowners and associations should have the power to decide whether a unit within a building can be used for short-term rentals or not. Do you think this could be a possibility, or are there other ideas and solutions that you have seen or foresee? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene. Then I saw Gordon Bosanac, sorry. How do you pronounce her surname?
Bosanac.
Bosanac.
Actually means Bosnian.
Sorry, Bosanac.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, just short intervention. It's really interesting when, from each of the positions we are hearing, there have been different data provided to us, MEPs also reminding us that there are the voters who will decide on our future, and they should be very careful. But so I was very interested in this data that 70% of the people in Europe live in their own properties, and only 30% are renting. And then you mentioned this 2/3, which are actually the private persons who are renting their properties. But can we dive more deep in this 2/3? How many private owners own one apartment? How many of them own 2? And how many owners we have which owns hundreds of apartments? And I think this is something we should look more carefully if we want to make tailor-made policies around renting. And just also to use this opportunity, I was unfortunately not at the first part of this hearing because of other obligations, but also I think that we should act much more faster than as now we are doing. I understand Commission position, dialogue, time, for us Greens, it's a little bit frustrating because we've been dedicated to the housing issue in the last term, so we had a lot of consultations, a lot of dialogue. Short-term rental directive was also done by our group, So I think that we should act a little bit more faster, and one opportunity which is now in front of us, it is the midterm review of cohesion policy. There are mayors left the building, but this is really now opportunity if we want the money to start to flow, to focus on that, because otherwise we are talking about 2029 and the measure that will be implemented. So who will be alive, who will be dead in 2029 in this world? Let's hope we will all be alive and good. But, just my appeal to speed it up.
Thank you for this optimistic outlook. Now we have Dirk Grotnik for the EPP.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panelists. I have the pleasure to be with Ms. Tinagli also in the Housing Committee. And this topic will come up. We in the EPP would have the headline of subsidiarity here. There is not a one-size-fits-all for all the different touristic cities in Europe, and the impact is very local and have to do with dynamics that I'm afraid Europe will not be able to tailor-make, regulate. It is something that we have tried to do in the Green Deal for the last 5 years, and to be honest, that's where a lot of the price driving came from. So building houses now is more expensive because we have laws in place of the past 5 years, and for very good reasons. But it is the case. So at the EPP, we've tried to look at. So the headline is it's not a European competence, but there's a lot of regulation that affects directly or indirectly building houses. And it has to do with market dysfunctions. It has to do with driving up regulatory burden for owners, but also for renters. I think that's what we'll be looking at. My feeling is a bit, what I hear is, because on the other hand, who lives in the center of their capitals anymore? Yes? Sorry, how many young people are able to afford living in their centers of their capitals? I can tell you it's not many. They're all living in satellite cities, at least an hour away from the capital. That's where our voters are. So it's not in the center of the cities. But then my question is, you're basically in between do something now or wait for the data coming from this new regulation. And I would tend to agree with the last position, to not be too wild on this policy before we actually know what we're talking about as an impact. If your reflection on that.
Thank you so much. And I put myself on the list as the very, very last speaker. Very quickly, can you specify a little bit if really the Green Deal is driving up the prices? Because for me, when I look about it, and look at the prices of oil, fossil fuel, heating, and so on, to me it seems cheaper to invest in green housing and energy efficiency and heat pumps because I will not have to pay the price in the future of fossil fuel. So probably you can talk about the life cycle thing, because at the beginning, of course, the investment costs are higher. This I get logically, but probably in the long run, I don't actually see this argument, but probably you can make this point. So I give the floor back to the panel and try to be more or less in 2 minutes. Thank you so much. Yeah, you start, Ms. Molnar.
Yeah, thank you very much. So to address the question on how can these competing rights between the short-term rentals and long-term rentals be balanced, short-term rental short-term rental regulation can address this issue. Let's wait until the short-term rental regulation provides the data. This regulation will give absolutely all the data authorities will need. When we will have the data, we will be able to see where is the balance and how cities can regulate in a proportionate and evidence-based manner. Another MEP was asking about detailed data on how many properties are being rented out. Again, short-term rental regulation on data collection and sharing. Because authorities, they will have registers, they will see absolutely who is owning what properties, who is advertising where, etc. Online platforms will provide activity data, how often these properties are being rented and for how many guests, etc. So we will have all the data. The regulation on short-term rental data collection and sharing starts applying from May 2026. I agree, we need to wait a long time for that, right? So we would really like to have this application really like yesterday. But, well, it is what it is. Let's wait for the results of the regulation. regarding the neighbors deciding if you can rent the property for short-term rental or not. Not a single service provider in Europe has such a obligation to ask neighbors. So this is like literally neighbors will never ever allow you to do certain things. There is a so-called NIMBY effect. I don't know if you have ever heard it. It is called not in my backyard. So which says that neighbors will never allow you to do certain things which you want to do. So this is somebody's property, and I think they should maintain the right to use the property in the way they want. And I agree with the Mr. Gotting remarks that one size fits all does not work for the short-term rentals. So we have a very good basis for regulating short-term rentals at the local level. That is the short-term rental regulation on data collection and sharing. But what works for Barcelona will not work for Kaunas. If you don't know where Kaunas is second by size city in Lithuania. I'm coming from Kaunas, from Lithuania. Kaunas receives 300,000 tourists a year, which is 50 times less than Barcelona. Barcelona welcomes 5 Lithuanian populations in 1 year. So as I said, what works for Barcelona, and we agree that there could be situations where short-term rentals need to be regulated, as long as the data proves that. But what works for Barcelona will not work for Kaunas, because we want to receive tourists and to get all the benefits coming from the tourists. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I know the feeling. I am from Chemnitz. We would love to have some tourists. Do you want to come? Sorry. That was just a side remark. So now back to Mark Bookwaite.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the question. The questions on the balancing of rights or of interests. I think it's a very interesting question, and probably there is a difference in a situation where the owner of a house actually lives in the house. I was in Firenze. Beautiful city, of course, a few months ago, and there's a big societal debate there on the so-called key boxes. So what is this? The owners of so many houses in the center of Firenze, they don't live there. They live somewhere in a beautiful hilly region around Firenze, but they own the property. A lot of the housing in Firenze, the city center, is being exploited constantly by short-term rentals. So that was just making your question maybe a bit more complex. We have to look further into what is the reality there. In Amsterdam, for example, we have a clear ruling on the association of owners of a given block. So say 10, 12 more apartments. They agree within themselves, then they have to agree within themselves. If one of the owners of the apartments wants to rent out his or her apartment or unit in that association, the others have to agree with that. So that's a way how you can balance it. I would think actually the highest interest or higher general public interest would be from the city government point of view. We need to maintain the livability in our city for all the people, either the residents, but also the visitors. That is really a higher public interest that I would like to bring in. And then on the regulation and the data, to be honest, I think I made it clear. We see now, as it is in preparation, it's going to be quite a challenge to see what quality of the data will be there. And I must say, I'm sorry, but in the previous years, we have seen so many litigations between cities and platforms on obtaining data at all that let's give it a chance. Let's see how it works. But let's be careful.
Thank you so much. And this is probably also something we can follow up as Parliament to check a little bit the enforcement of the short-term rentals regulation. So now I give the floor back to Barbara Steenbergen.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. Yeah, I think we should do policy based on evidence. I absolutely agree with you, Mr. Goting. But we do have evidence, plenty of evidence. We do have yearly statistics of Eurostat, OECD, on the unaffordability of housing, about the concentration on housing markets, about the rise of inflation and consumer prices. So we do have evidence enough. I also do think in this term of this legislative term, we have the Special Committee for Housing, which has 1 year the time to do something. And I think there we should set up something. At least this is something what also the Commission expects from us in the mission letter of our new commissioner. So I think let's start now with the data basis we have concerning my constituency, so the tenants. We are, in the meantime, we are more than 1/3 of the European population, tendency rising because home ownership is unaffordable, more and more unaffordable for the broad sources of the society. And there I'm talking also for middle-income households. For them, home ownership is not an option anymore. Let's not talk about the young people. We call them generation rent because they will not be able to own something with these price increases that we have. So I think it is extremely urgent that we act now. And to Mrs. Cavazzini, I think it is also important. We do this hearing here from the consumer point of view. We do have also a new consumer agenda for the next legislative period. And I do think the monitoring, or let me say it even harder, the surveillance of market abuse in housing markets would be one extremely crucial issue to do. We do have from the consumer side the institution of watchdogs. So I think we should have watchdogs on the housing market to prevent further abuse, speculation and financialization. And that will give us also a lot of data because these watchdogs, they provide data. They have the cases as well as we do have the cases on the tenants union because we represent the tenants which are threatened by gentrification, displacement and eviction in front of the courts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we go back to Mr. Warnecke.
Thank you. There were a lot of questions. I tried my best, so I did very short. Concerning the condo, can a condo forbid the use of Airbnb? That would be a yes for most of the European countries. The difficult part would be what would be the amount of votes you need. For most of the condo laws, that will be unanimity. Another word like taxonomy I can't pronounce, unanimity. And you will never get unanimity in a condo. That's a little problem. So in theory, yes. In praxis, no. And then concerning the private landlords, 2/3 being operative on the market or in charge of 2/3 of the apartments on the housing market. I can tell you only for Germany, the majority has 1 to 2 apartments. I would recommend to ask the tax administration because they can clearly see by the taxes you pay on the rental income, if it's 1, 2 or 3 apartments, but for private landlords, it's 1 or 2 apartments. Think about the standard European house with a shop in the basement and an apartment for the shop owner and house owner on the first floor, and on the second floor you rent out. That would be a classic private landlord or a classic house everywhere in Europe. So you know what the classic landlord is. Wait for results. If you have changed a law and you're examining the results of the change of law, wait for the results to come in. And concerning the amount of money you have to spend, it would be not honest if I would have an answer to that question because it's strongly depending on the way the situation the building is in, and of course the development of the energy prices. What I can tell you is that the CO2 pricing will be going to the European Union in 2027. And there is no mechanism in place to refund that money back to the citizens. And believe me, it will be a free market CO2 pricing. That's what you decided. That will be really, really expensive to the households. So you should, if you think about housing, you should think about a mechanism to pay back the CO2. Otherwise, you'll have an uproar all over Europe. So why are people now afraid to invest in maybe a heat pump? Well, the answer is They are, at least in Germany, very, very expensive right now compared to other countries. So they have on short term, a very high investment. Maybe that would be something to look at as well. The Agora Energiewende, you will know, Huami has just published a survey that a heat pump, same product by the same company, costs in some European countries 2,000 euros, and the top price is 20,000 euros for the same product within the EU, within the internal market. So there is really gold digging going on. So that would be a result of the regulation as well. Maybe you have a look at that. Thank you.
Yes, just a few words about your question about the cost and the impact of the Green Deal. If today you want to buy, from a construction company perspective, an electric excavator, you will pay more expensively than a non-electric one. Same for green cement, you will pay it more. So this is an impact. But also it was mentioned the cost of energy. You have energy-intensive industry like the steel, which is used, also has an impact. Legislation as well. You mentioned heat pumps. We have a colleague from Luxembourg who said, I was buying heat pumps in Germany, and because of the legislation, from one day to the other, the price of heat pumps went up by 25%, simply because now there is an obligation to go into that direction. So it has made an impact. Indeed, having said that, there are also means, and this is where we are trying to do our homework, to work also on increasing the productivity of the construction process itself, trying to compensate also this cost. Digitalization is one of the means that can be used both at industry but also at administration level to try to compensate these differences, these gaps in costs.
Thank you so much to all the experts and, of course, also to the members. I think it was also an excellent panel, sorry that you had to wait so long, but thanks for bearing with us even like half an hour longer. I think it was very insightful and clearly not the last time we speak about this topic. And, of course, also with our special committee on the housing crisis, I'm sure they also have a lot of activities planned. So we, as Parliament, take this topic very seriously. So this concludes our housing hearing. We have one last item on the agenda item 14, where we discuss the draft opinion on the MFF own initiative report from the Budge Committee. And probably we take like 1 minute until everyone who doesn't want to listen to the Budge discussion can leave the room, and then we continue with agenda item 14. So, dear colleagues, again, if you're not wanting to take part in the MFF discussion, please, you can continue outside. I imagine there is still a lot to talk about, but probably not in the room. So thanks for leaving the room if you're not wanting to talk about the budget. And the others, I suggest we start because we have our coordinators meeting in half an hour and we have to finish. So also the advisors, hello dear advisors, can you please be a little bit more quiet? Thank you. Thank you so much. So today we want to discuss the draft opinion on the budget, and I give the floor to our rapporteur, Ms. Aura Sala.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. The next MFF will determine not only the financing, but also the shape of EU policies and programmes, and what our core strategic focus is as a union. The geopolitical and security situation, as well as possible future enlargement of the EU, will require fundamental changes to the upcoming MFF. Before the Commission presents their proposal, it is essential that the Parliament forms its strong position. In my draft opinion for the Budget Committee, I have focused on key aspects related to the internal market and the IMCO Committee's work. The aim is to ensure that we take a targeted approach, prioritising the relevant issues for our competitiveness from the internal market's perspective. The next MFF must also efficiently address our new security environment, supporting free market economy and sustainable growth. At the same time, it is crucial to advance green growth, circular economy and sustainability, as these are key to strengthening Europe's long-term competitiveness, resource efficiency and economic resilience. In my draft opinion, I have highlighted that the next MFF must streamline processes, align with the EU's new competitiveness compass and be more resilient. It should be prepared for future enlargements and flexible enough to handle crises without distorting the free market. The focus of the EU must now be on the enforcement of existing regulation and not adding new layers. To do that, adequate resources must be allocated to ensure proper enforcement of single market rules, including product safety regulations. For example, upcoming reforms to the Union Customs Code must have the resources to tackle unsafe and illegal products imported via e-commerce platforms from countries like China. It must be flexible and make use of the reallocation of funding to enhance the competitiveness of the EU and strengthen the sustainable single market for goods and services. Accessing financing should also not be a bureaucratic nightmare. We must have an excellence-based approach to EU funding, ensuring that resources are allocated to projects and initiatives that demonstrate the highest potential for innovation and competitiveness. Finally, a comprehensive security strategy within the MFF can enhance the internal market by fostering competitiveness and innovation. Investments in defence often have possible spillover effects on civilian economy through integrated supply chains and cross-border business opportunities. I look forward to working with my colleagues in IMCO and look forward to seeing your amendments and ideas. I am confident we can come to an agreement and a good opinion that can be taken strongly into consideration by the Budget Committee and ensure that the internal market is a top priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do now the round of shadows and start with the SND, José Cepeda.
Well, I prefer to speak in Spanish, please. Well, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. First of all, what I'd like to do is thank the rapporteur, Mrs. Sala, for her work on this. In your work, I've seen a couple of references which really stood out, where you talked about the social as a term, as a concept, is super important for us. What's social is basically making sure that we have a policy here in the European Parliament that addresses the citizens of Europe. That social has to be in there. So, if you take out social in some of the amendments, for instance, that's something that really struck me. That's one point I wanted to flag. Another proposal, well, I've got a couple of amendments that I'd like to put forward with some relevant proposals. I mean, broadly speaking, I share the objective and the strategic line adopted by the rapporteur here, the concept of security and defence, for instance, particularly bearing in mind what the Prime Minister of Finland has said, also the Polish presidency during this semester. We understand perfectly well that this is the line that's being followed here. So what we would like to do is suggest an increase in the contribution made by member states to the budget. I think that would be fundamentally important. It's important because it will give an impetus to some of the issues that are flagged here and which are of relevance to this particular committee, which we would like to see. Coordination of support policies, for instance, for competitiveness, for one thing, but also coordination with decarbonisation measures. That too needs to be part of the equation. I think it needs to be explicitly mentioned in this report. Or indeed the inter-report, which I think is highly relevant, the strengthening of a integrated digital single market, completely integrated. I mean, all of these measures will allow us to move forward on these issues, and I think that's something we all hope for, we all would like to see. And it's also, I think, a requirement, and we need to make it more clear, it seems to me. Harmonisation as well, harmonisation in order to have strategic autonomy vis-à-vis other geopolitical entities in the world. I will also be putting forward another idea which I think is relevant in this domain, namely a digital sovereignty creation of such a fund. I think that would help shore up the point made by Mrs. Sala earlier on, the fact that we would have greater capacity for our own industries, for our own jobs, for our own products, technological products in particular. We want to make sure that critical digital tools are used to a much greater extent. The question of the microchip industry, artificial intelligence, open codes, etc., etc. There's a whole global debate going on about these matters right now, and we need to pay attention to that, and also our whole defence and security strategy. And this has been raised quite clearly by the Prime Minister in question. So all of that is important. We need to have also fair access when it comes to funding for companies. At the end of the day, we're all working towards that, and we're working to make sure that these European values are promoted. And at the same time, we need to have greater visibility. It's important to protect our consumers to a greater extent, in particular users, those who will be using artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence going forward, making sure that we shore up security, that we protect ourselves against disinformation, misinformation on digital markets. And there are other ideas, such as social conditionality, that should be included in, for instance, our farming funds or agricultural funds. We also need to make sure that all legislation is complied with across the board throughout the European Union, so compliance is of the essence when it comes to employment, when it comes to health for workers. I mean, from our vantage point, these are all crucially important points. Final point that I wanted to raise, our union policy needs to be in sync with our domestic expenditure. We don't want to increase red tape, bureaucracy all too much. Again, I think that's a shared objective. I think we all refer to this, all hope for this, and therefore we need to look at national plans. I mean, the Commission itself in its communication raised this possibility within the context of the MFF. Of course, we have to bear in mind that the union budget is a small part of our national expenditure, and our member states already have a mechanism for the coordination of European funds, so bear that in mind. That is why we're working with the CONT committee in particular on these issues, and I thought it was important, therefore, to raise these points for the kind attention of our rapporteur, Mrs. Sala. I hope that my amendments will be constructive and help shore up the report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For the PFE, I don't know if you want to speak. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to highlight that all EU spending must fully respect the principle of subsidiarity and proportionality, ensuring that national governments maintain the right to determine their own financial priorities. Important to note that from our side, I do not see any need for new own resources. We should primarily focus on current, not want to be effective, and eliminating tax evasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For ECR, Piotr Müller.
I will speak Polish. Szanowni Państwo, debata o budżecie jest niezwykle ważna oczywiście, ponieważ rozmawiamy.
Talking about the budget, obviously, is always important because we always mention the monies of our taxpayers. So the first thing that worries me in this regard is the issue of potential increase in taxes. Because if we decided to seek more money and if we decided to increase the taxes, we would, as a group, definitely be against. Also, what we see as a potential threat would be the common agricultural policy as we have known it so far. So we would be critical about any cuts in this regard, especially if you look at the agreement with Mercosur and the possibility to import goods from Americas. I think it could create a threat to our food security in Europe. What also worries us is the potential limitation when it comes to regional policy, especially when it comes to cohesion policy, bridging gaps between the regions of Europe when it comes to various aspects of cohesion policy. So we will definitely produce amendments on this. And just last two comments. One would be the attempts to focus too much on green transition. We hope that the European Parliament will introduce changes soon when it comes to the actual current version of the Green Deal. So any moves in this regard would not be supported by us. We should focus on security policy as a priority. Our dilemma would be, where should we go? For Green Deal or maybe for protecting our borders, external borders? I would definitely be for protecting and spending more money on protecting external borders of the EU in view of the potential war. We know what it usually looks like with the budgeting in the EU. We saw it in the past when it came to the special post-COVID assistance instrument and the whole criterion of rule of law. We are not for allowing the European Commission to block the expenditure or dispensing of the money for a given member state based on such a criterion. I can again quote Poland as an example. As you very well know, some time ago, the European Commission said that in Poland there had been a breach of rule of law. It referred to rights of a Spanish journalist, alleged Spanish journalist, actually a Russian immigrant. And basically, European Commission quoted examples like this, which was then later treated as an example that Poland does not provide media freedom. And then the money was not disbursed to Poland as it should have been. The situation with this alleged Spanish but actually a Russian spy journalist was really a case in point. Thank you.
For Renew, I don't see anybody, nor for the Greens, nor for the left, nor for the ESN. So with that, I'd like to give the floor back to the rapporteur.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. Thank you for your thoughts. I would just like to highlight that for me, a subsidiary principle is a key when it comes to issues. And personally, I'm not a fan of new funds. But that being said, I want to thank you of your thoughts and looking forward to working with you on this draft.
Thank you so much. I wish you a lot of success. So this concludes agenda item 14 and the official meeting. If there is not any other business, I can let you know that the next meetings of the IMCO committee will happen the 17th and 18th of March. And then we have our coordinators at 17:30. So we have a tiny little break and the coordinators meet back at 17:30. And the others, I wish you a very nice evening.